I'm a great believer in trying to do things that people in the past did. You can learn so much by actually experiencing things the way they did in the Middle Ages. Today's guest set herself the challenge of creating a medieval book from scratch, literally. She created the vellum, she ground the pigments, and immersed herself in the process of medieval bookmaking. Today, Sara Charles is here to tell us about what she learned. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome to another episode of Future Imperfect. I've got another wonderful guest with me, and as always, I would just like them to introduce themselves, because I always think when somebody introduces themselves, you get a different perspective on them. So fire away, please.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. My name is Sara Charles. My background actually is in libraries. I trained as a librarian. Through that, got very interested in medieval manuscripts. And I decided I wanted to get that real hands-on experience of what it would have been like for a medieval manuscript maker. So I then started to play about with the processes they would have done. So making the ink, the pigments, the parchment, all the sort of various stages of the whole process.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I think I've had a go at most things now. And then you can really experience what it would have been like and how the body would have been involved with those processes and built up that muscle memory, the various sensory things going on, the smells, the sounds, all that sort of thing that really sort of brings the whole process together.
Oh, sounds wonderful. We're going to have a lot to talk about. I'm going to go to sort of an earlier level and ask about books as a thing. How do you define a book as opposed to a parchment itself? So we'll start at that very beginning, because books were very different in the medieval period, as far as I understand it, in terms of the social status value than we think of books now.
Yeah, okay. So, I think we should probably go back even further then to the classical period, where most things were written on papyrus and then rolled up into a scroll. This was used for classical texts and for Jewish texts as well. And then when Christianity came along, for whatever reason, they seemed to embrace this new format of the codex, which were folded papyrus or parchment, stacked into quires, and then made into text block.
Okay, so stored flat rather than rolled up.
Yeah, that's right. And so, of course, the obvious advantage is that you can flip through rather than having to
unscroll.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing. There's so much of the vocabulary that was used then is now used today. Of course, we scroll through, Twitter feeds and things like that. So,
of course.
And there's still so much crossover between those things. But it may have been a conscious decision by the early Christians. Maybe they were looking to make themselves different from, the Roman and the Jewish practices. They may have thought this is a way we can define ourselves if we use this new codex formula. Maybe it was just, a serendipitous thing, but they started using the codex, and with the spread of Christianity, it then became more and more popular.
Does it allow you to store more data in a smaller space than a scroll, potentially?
It does, yeah, because papyrus, it tends to be easier to write on just one side rather than the other because of the way that the direction of the fibres are knitted together. One side's much easier than the other. And also, it's easier to fold into a codex and navigate, as I've said. But interestingly, when you look at a lot of the early codices, they don't seem to be saving space. So it doesn't seem to have been a particular issue, and particularly when we move into sort of the 5th and the 6th centuries, the text is very spread out and with very generous margins. So maybe not. But the other thing as well, with Roman and Jewish scrolls, you would tend to have just one particular text per scroll. Whereas with the New Testament, you would want all of that in one volume. So a codex was particularly useful for that.
So in a way, a codex is a sort of micro library, or sort of mini library of works. So a scroll is an individual thing, and perhaps psychologically they wanted a collection of works together thematically or,
Yeah.
So is that the origin of the book then? That is what we think of as a book. I love the idea that we still use the term scroll. I didn't even think about it when I said it, and I didn't think Every time I'm going to use social media, I'm referring back to the ancients.
That's right, yeah. And the codex, the word, it comes from the Latin word caudex for block of wood. So it's referring to the book boards that were between those blocks. So, yeah, you get all these connections between them and between the natural world as well, which is nice.
So the earliest books were all handwritten, I guess. Were they expensive? Were they sort of very show-offy pieces? Or how were they seen in society at the time?
Well, they were, particularly to an illiterate society in the early medieval period, they were just seen as, absolutely unbelievable objects. And because the whole monastic ethos was that writing these books was a prayer in itself, was an act of piety, you kind of imbued the text with all that spirituality. You would have had the images in gold, which would have just been amazing to people. And we have one example of Boniface, who was the missionary who went over to Germany and all that area. And he writes to Edburga, who was an abbess in England, and asks her to send him some more books written in gold, basically to impress the pagans.
Right.
So, it was like they couldn't read, but, you hold up this shining, amazing thing of, it would have had a real visual impact. As you go on, as things change in the medieval period, there's more money coming around. And it would have been conspicuous consumption. They would have been objects to be seen about town.
So if you had a single book, it was probably quite a social statement. That it was not a usual thing. Nobody would have libraries as such, or ordinary people certainly wouldn't have had libraries.
Yeah, books would have belonged to the monasteries, which were, a lot of them were extremely wealthy, or, perhaps kings and members of the court. But as you move into sort of the 12th, 13th century and you get the rise of the merchant class, then, owning a book would definitely have been a status symbol.
That's really interesting. Just to backtrack a bit, papyrus is, as I understand it, made from a kind of reed. Is that right? You're talking about the material culture. So can you explain that a little bit? And then that sounds like it was only available in certain places and therefore other substitutes had to be created. So do you want to take us through that? Because that sounds fascinating too.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. It was only grown along the banks of the Nile. So, of course, the Egyptians had the complete monopoly on the trade of that, which after a while is going to cause problems. But of course, it's a reed that's grown along the banks and its stem is cut down and then sliced thinly, and one layer is placed vertically and the other layer horizontally and just sort of bashed together, and the plant gum sort of seals it all. So you end up with this sheet of papyrus.
So it's a mat of vegetable material. It's not woven though, is it? It's squished together.
Yeah, that's right. And as it dries, all the fibres all knit together. But as I say, one side would have been very, very nice to write on because the plant fibres would have been going in that direction. The verso side wouldn't have been so easy. So, you pretty much are limited to just one side. And then, as I say, it did cause all sorts of disputes because the Egyptians wouldn't allow certain people to have it and things like that.
So they controlled access to the only version of paper that existed in the ancient world.
Yeah, so understandably, people started looking for alternatives. There's a place called Pergamon, which is said to have been the place that invented parchment. It didn't. It probably became known for producing parchment, but it's very unlikely that suddenly one day someone decided that they could do something with an animal skin. So in about the 1st century, we've got Pliny writing about Pergamon as being this place for parchment production. So clearly parchment was being used at this time.
Right.
Of course, the disadvantage is that it's not quite as humane.
Yes, because parchment is leather.
Yeah, it's animal skin, mainly from 3 types of animals, which are livestock: goats, sheep, and calves. They produce the best parchment. But it's very, very flexible, very hard wearing. So it makes it an ideal material, especially with the new codex, which needs to be folded. And so you don't get that stress along the fold line that you do with papyrus. So, maybe it was down to the Egyptians, and their monopoly, but that actually encouraged the use or the development of parchment.
And the physical structure of the medium on which you're writing informed the way that information was stored in a really interesting way. So if it could be folded, then they were folding it, whereas before rolling was more effective because of the medium.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we do have examples of papyrus codices, so they were folded, but that doesn't last for very long. So I think they were just trying this new medium of the codex with the folded papyrus or parchment, and then realised that parchment was actually much better. So
what about the cost of this material? Because obviously, if writing and books were very rare, then the sort of cost of the raw material is a component of it, but it's not that significant when somebody's handwriting something, and time is important. But was papyrus more expensive because it had to travel further? So let's say somebody's writing a book in England in what used to be called the Dark Ages, but in the early medieval period. Would it have been much more expensive to use parchment than papyrus, theoretically, or not, because of the travel time? I don't know. Was it made locally as well?
Yeah, I don't think papyrus would have even been available in England after the Roman Empire.
So medieval England wouldn't have had papyrus to write on at all, just didn't travel that far?
No, not to my knowledge. And I think, certainly by the early centuries, then parchment was becoming much more of a normal medium.
Right.
I mean, you did refer to the Dark Ages because of this lack of anything written down from that time. So we just don't know. But I mean, apart from anything else, the conditions in England do not lend themselves well for papyrus storage. Wet and damp is really not good for...
Of course, so you've got your landscape environment to think about. Damp, foggy days are going to get everywhere, and it's going to moisten everything, and mold's going to grow and everything.
Yeah,
reeds that have come all the way from the Nile probably aren't going to survive very well.
That's right.
Was paper a thing at all?
Not until the later Middle Ages, in Europe anyway.
Okay.
In China it was used, but in Europe it sort of comes in around the 12th, 13th century. And even then it was seen as much more of an ephemeral material. Your proper stuff went on parchment. Maybe paper was used for wrapping things or just scribbling notes or things like that. But then with the development of the printing press with Johannes Gutenberg, parchment wasn't so good to be used for printing on. It's greasy, it moves around a lot. It's impossible to get a completely flat piece of parchment, whereas paper, of course, is much easier to handle in that type of environment. So that's another reason why, as well as cost, paper kind of ended up overtaking parchment.
So again, it's a physical medium that then is more useful and swaps over, and then we get movable type and printing, and I think we then get more people. Books become cheaper, don't they? And more freely available, and they weren't freely available.
Yeah.
And then if you go later, I remember somebody telling me about pamphlets, which were the equivalent of social media later, where people were sort of were printing kind of inflammatory political statements on bits of paper and handing them out in market squares.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the early medieval period, a lot.
So I think we should probably touch on the process for parchment making. So it's the skin of an animal.
Yeah.
That animal is presumably slaughtered for food as well.
Yeah, in most cases, it probably was a byproduct. If the animal was going to be slaughtered for meat anyway, you'd want to make as much as you can of the whole carcass. So you would have used the animal horns, you would have used the bladders for water containers, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the skin would have been used for either leather or parchment. So it was a very kind of organic process. Everything was made use of.
Was it a long and complicated process to make parchment if it was expensive? Or was it just one of those things that medieval people did?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly the wealthier monasteries, they would have owned a lot of land with a lot of livestock on. So, it probably wasn't so much of an issue for those. There's also an interesting idea that a lot of the monasteries didn't have meat-based diets. They actually had more vegetarian diets. I think certainly Bede talks about things like that. So in that case, the animals wouldn't have been necessarily slaughtered for meat. But if you're looking at calf skin, which is the best, that's considered, the best grade of parchment because it has a lovely creamy quality. If you are slaughtering those calves around 6 to 8 weeks, they wouldn't have had much meat on them anyway. So it is possible that these calves were just being bred and slaughtered for parchment. But in the wealthier monasteries, they would have had the means to do that. It would have been more important for them to create a beautiful, something like the Lindisfarne Gospels, That would have been much more important than the cost of these animals.
Well, I also think that back in the medieval day, ordinary people were much closer to life and death.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have your own animals and you would need to slaughter them yourself
Yeah.
to eat well. I mean, there were people that were vegetarian, as you said. There were sort of religious rules on what you could eat when and things like that. I remember looking at the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, and obviously it's very faded now. It's beautiful and really interesting conceptual map, sort of a map of the world in some areas, and then there's lots of legends on it and monsters and, the Minotaur's maze and then heaven as well, And so it's quite a complex idea, but it was a single sheet of parchment.
Yeah.
It was basically the complete skin of one calf, which is kind of sad, but in a way, it's also kind of fascinating. It's still there and it's still looked at by millions of people. Anyway, so what about book binding? The way we might think of as a sort of standard posh hardback book. Is that what we talk about with the codexes, or is it more of a pile with boards on somehow?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been the same process that was used all through the medieval period, really. If you've got a sheet, so if you have a sheet like this is a bifolium. This is imagine it's one large sheet of parchment.
Yeah.
It would have been already written and decorated, so it's ready to be bound. It would have been folded in the middle, so then this becomes one folio, and this is the second folio.
So it's basically a folded over sheet of material.
Yeah.
And then it's stitched along the spine, is it?
It's a bit more complicated than that. So it's put inside another one, and you would have had about 4 of these. So 4 sheets folded over together, and this is called a quire. Then you would get another one of 4 sheets folded over, stacked on top of that one, and carry on going like that. And when you've got your text block all finished, stacked up together, then you sew it together. You'd go through the middle of each quire.
So it's a stack, and then along the spine, the folded spine, there's a kind of an external stitching, there's an external kind of reinforcement.
Yeah, the sewing stations. And this is on alum tawed leather. So again, it's a very, very flexible but strong material. And this would have just given the book extra support. Particularly, you've got this constant opening and closing. This hinge here takes the most beating. So you want to make it as strong as you can.
Right, so the top hinge is the one that's going to be under the most stress for the longest time.
Yeah,
right, okay.
That's the one that gets the most use. And this is a herringbone stitch on here, but there would have been different types of stitches.
Right, so the particular styles of book making. Does that mean we can recognise who or where the book comes from-ish?
To an extent.
Okay.
I mean, interestingly, you've got the St Cuthbert Gospels, which is, I think, an 8th or 9th century codex that was actually found in Cuthbert's tomb. And that is called a Coptic binding. And that was based on the earlier papyrus codexes, which is a bit more basic. But it's really interesting to see that was being used in England at that time.
Oh, so that's a binding that was typically used on papyrus is now being used on parchment, using the same style, therefore implying that it's quite early in the development of books and bookbinding, perhaps.
In sort of that part of the Mediterranean around Egypt, they carried on using that Coptic binding, whereas England, northwestern Europe, they developed a new binding with the sewing stations. So it's just interesting, you can say to a certain extent, yes, this happened here and yes, this happened there, but there's always these kind of weird exceptions that come out.
History is always like that, isn't it? I'm always having discussions with people. How do we know for sure? And the answer is we don't know for sure. No. We have a certain amount of evidence.
Exactly.
We have some things that give us indications. We have some general thoughts and ideas, but there might be some new data comes up and throws it all away.
Yeah.
Which is why I find history fascinating, because it's actually about people. And as a result, people don't necessarily follow the rules, in the way we might expect. I was talking to somebody about armour, and I was saying, well, couldn't somebody wear old armour on the battlefield? It's like, yeah, of course they could.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if you had to fight a battle, which probably nobody wants to do, if the only armour you have access to is your granddad's helmet, you're going to wear your granddad's helmet, aren't you?
Exactly, yeah, make do and mend, yeah.
Yeah, who cares about fashion?
Yeah.
I'd like to get back to the sort of creation of books as well, because I have this image possibly formed by watching The Name of the Rose movie with Sean Connery. Lovely movie, very gothic, of sort of a dark scriptorum and sort of slightly, well, very eccentric monks
Mm.
working hard all hours and having bad eyesight and writing. What's the reality of a scriptorium and the reality of how these were made?
Yeah, well, the short answer is we don't really know.
Okay.
I think there's kind of like two main things for us today why we have this image of a scriptorium. The first one is from St. Gall, which is in Switzerland. There's this 9th century plan of a monastery layout. So it's like an architectural blueprint. So it's got the church, it's got the sleeping quarters, it's got the outbuildings where the livestock were kept and the various, leather making and things like that went on. And you have a room that's marked just next to the altar. Well, it's a separate room, but it's down the east end of the church. And it's the library and the seats for the scribes. Now, I'm pretty sure that Umberto Eco based his scriptorium in the Name of the Rose on this blueprint. But the problem is this monastery doesn't exist. So it seems like this was a kind of a Carolingian ideal, maybe a standardization, because they were very much into standardizing everything. That's why we have the Caroline minuscule script that was adopted across Europe and sort of became the standard way of writing. But there is actually no evidence that this monastery ever existed with this separate room for the library and the scribes. But it still really persists. I was at an exhibition in Reichenau just last week, actually, which is an island monastery. It produced absolutely beautiful manuscripts from the sort of 8th, 9th, 10th century. And it had the big plan there, and it had like the scriptorium. And so this idea really, really persists, despite the fact that there is actually no archaeological evidence from monasteries that there was a separate room for a scriptorium, as much as I think we would all like to be, because I love the Name of the Rose, and that was one of the things that first really inspired me. But it's just weird, considering scribes were writing all the time, that they didn't actually write about where they were writing.
Okay.
And we've got these odd snippets, and it seems to be that the cloister would have been the place for writing. It wouldn't have been a separate room dedicated for scribes.
Oh, that's fascinating. So the idea of specific room set aside, we just don't know. There doesn't seem to be any evidence particularly for that. But I have this idea. So you might have had people sitting in those sort of window seats with a lovely enclosed area of the light coming in and writing things, maybe leaning over, chatting to somebody else about something while they're sort of working on their lap, with other people walking past them doing the perambulations, because it was used for walking and it was undercover. So it's sort of really nice and civilized way of going for a walk.
This is what I always find quite strange, because like the cloister was kind of like the hub of the monastic community. It was the gateway between the inside and the outside. And so you would have had people coming and going all the time. So I thought, well, that must have been really distracting. But if you read some of the guidelines for individual monasteries, they will say things like there must be complete silence where the scribes are and things like that. And the librarian has to sort of, keep them all in order. So I still think it's strange, but that's where all the evidence points. There isn't much evidence, but the evidence we do have refers to the cloister.
Well, I liken that to, I used to do quite a lot of writing and thinking in a coffee shop.
Right.
Work on my laptop or my notepad, go to a coffee shop, because I quite liked the white noise of bustle.
Right.
And sometimes actually working in the library with the silence and everybody desperately trying to get their essay done in time for their tutorial was a bit too sort of almost pressured. I found it was much easier to do my creative writing in a more public environment. I mean, it's sometimes distracting and you find yourself staring off, but I wonder if some people liked that and others wanted a quiet corner, individuals.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, because there is so much we don't know. We can use our own experiences to think, what it would have been like. And of course, you would have had the cloister garden as well. So I just think that must have been really nice, if your eyes are worn out and your hands aching, to just sort of, sit back and rest your eyes on the greenery in the cloister garden.
I had this funny idea. They're all in the cloister. They're all writing away, all concentrating. There's a few murmured conversations. And suddenly somebody looks up and goes, lads, it's going to start raining. And everybody's kind of grabbing their stuff to take it under cover. I just think that's a wonderful idea. Whether it ever happened, I don't know. But I find that incredibly amusing. How much did they actually produce? How many pages could one scribe write in a day, for example? I don't know.
Good question. How long's a piece of string? Depends on so many things. I mean,
Right.
you've got the length of the text itself, maybe the quality of the parchment or the ink, if that's not flowing particularly well or something like that. And you've also, within the monastery compound, you adhere to the times of prayer. So you would be constantly interrupted, just when you're kind of getting into your flow,
Yeah.
bell rings, it's time to go off for nuns or whatever. So it's really hard to know. I think some academics have worked out that maybe 4 or 5 pages a day,
Okay.
which doesn't seem like much. But then if you did have a group of you working on the same manuscript, it might not take as long as you would think.
It's actually slightly faster than I thought because some of them are so beautifully done.
Yeah.
Can we tell individual hands of scribes? And also, did they ever write notes to themselves? Because I remember seeing marginalia, and that's something we should talk about, that somebody saying, my hands are cold and I need a beer, or
Yeah.
equivalents to that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, we can tell individual hands. They'll often have a little quirky way of doing a certain letter. Gs are always good ones to look for because everyone seems to have their own style of doing G. This is harder in monasteries where you had a very, they were all trained in a particular style. It can be harder to unpick those.
So they were actively trying to have a consistent style then in some places.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. There is a scribe known as the tremulous hand of Worcester, who's been studied, and academics think that he may have had some kind of neurological condition. So his hand would shake. So you can see that, it's very shaky handwriting. And so that can be very distinctive to pick out in the manuscripts that he wrote. And there's also one instance where his writing is very shaky, and then the next line, it's much better. So it's possible that he may have had a break, possibly had his lunch, some ale, and that, sort of calmed the tremors for a bit.
Oh, wonderful. What an amazing story. So, wobbly hand,
Yeah.
wherever you are,
Yeah.
we're talking about you now.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and the scribes, they did like to moan a lot, and you can kind of really feel their pain sometimes. They moan about it being too cold, or the ink not being very good, or the parchment being bad. And I think there's one who says he's been killed by ale, so it means he's hungover. But you get to sympathise with them a lot more when you see these moanings in the margins. There's a lovely one as well of an Irish scribe who his cat's gone missing. So he's sort of writing little updates in the margins. He hasn't seen his white cat and he wonders where it's gone. And unfortunately, we don't know what happened. Don't know if the white cat ever came back. But it's those real connections with the people from the past that is just lovely.
That's wonderful. So they weren't ashamed of writing little notes.
No.
Or even making jokes. Marginalia gives us some really interesting images from the time, doesn't it, I think? And these are little drawings. So do you want to talk about that a bit? Because some of those, I think, are quite fascinating.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's one particular example called the Luttrell Psalter, which is in the British Library, 14th century, maybe 15th century. But it has these amazing images, hybrid creatures and things contorted in really strange ways, things that don't make any sense. And Michael Camille, who was the wonderful art historian, he thinks that it may have been this sort of juxtaposed between the sacred and the profane, so you've got this Psalter, which is the Psalms, which is, all about worshipping God and very holy and very respected, alongside these silly things that are going on, which is real life. You would have had, marvellous cathedrals, but you would have had donkeys crapping outside them and things like, you've got this constant mixture of the wonderful and the real life.
Well, the holy and the profane. And also, I would imagine, are there any political comments? Do they sort of make fun of the abbot at all, or that kind of thing? Is there any of that sort of slight rebellion going on in marginalia?
Yeah, it probably is poking fun at the institutions and things. There's a famous French manuscript of a nun picking penises out of a tree.
Oh, wow.
Putting them in her basket, yeah. Right. So, yeah.
There's some odd ones as well, because I've looked at quite a few for reference for combat and things like that, and you've got quite a few flips. So you've got situations where it looks like you've got hares or rabbit. I think they're more likely hares because they've got big long ears. So hares capturing a person and sort of flaying them
Yeah.
alive. And that's quite gruesome and macabre.
Yeah, it's a very popular theme, the rabbits and the hares
Yeah.
hunting people. And again, yeah, like you say, it's just that flip. So everything is sort of upside down and back to front in this strange world.
People seem to be riding snails a lot as well. There's a whole
Yes.
thing. There seems to be a disproportionate, from what I've seen anyway, and I haven't done the stats on it, but a disproportionate number of people riding snails in the marginalia.
Yeah.
Do we have a clue what that's about?
Not really.
Yeah.
Just, why not? It's a bit silly. They could.
Yeah.
And again, because a lot of the, in things like books of hours, the images at the start of each prayer would be very prescriptive. They would have had to have been done a certain way and in a certain style. Whereas the margins, it's this kind of free space.
I wonder if they were ever said, yeah, there's this free space, we've got to fill it up.
Yeah.
So just go a bit wild. We've got some more red ink, it's really good.
Yeah.
Just do what you like, and I want it finished by the end of the day.
Yeah, they're wonderfully executed as well. They're absolutely beautiful. So they clearly put a lot of effort into them.
So these people were real artists. They weren't just writing things out. They were artists who were good at their job, which is writing things down, but also they had a quality to the line and the observation as well.
Yeah, certainly as the medieval period went on and the manuscript making became more of a commercial thing and moved out of the monasteries, you would have had scribes and you would have had illuminators as separate occupations. But the interesting thing is they often would have all lived on the same street. So you have Cat Street in Oxford. And from the tenement records and things like that, we know that the scribes, illuminators, bookbinders, they all lived on this same street, presumably working together. So they had this really lovely community and presumably were sharing ideas. And you have this big melting pot of that profession going on.
And so one person will be writing out, leaving space for the illustrator, and then kind of hand it over and say, your job is to fill these bits in, and then pass it on to the next person. So almost an industrial, and not industrial, but, a certain organisation, it seems then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you would have had the parchmenter, which wasn't the parchment maker, as you would have thought, but the parchmenter, he was kind of like the project manager for the whole thing. So probably you went to the parchmenter and said, I would like a psalter with X amount of images. I've got this much money. And he would then go down to Cat Street and say, right, you scribe, you've got the time to do this, you can do this, and then move on to the illuminator. So he or she would have been overseeing the whole process.
Oh, so project manager. So you've got a project manager, a producer, whatever we want to call it, who organises it. And it might be, we've got a limited budget for this, lads. So I'll go to the new illustrator that's turned up because they're not well known. And I wonder if they made specifications like no gold in this, lads, because we can't afford it.
Quite possibly, yeah, because you see such a variety of different types. Often you'll just have one gold initial at the beginning and then maybe coloured ink, but it's like the first page. They'll go all out on that one and then, the funds run out.
So the concept of judging a book by its cover was wrong even back then. It was like, you want the cover to be really fancy in the first page because there's a fair chance nobody's going to read any further anyway. So it's like those kind of complex coffee table books that people buy and try to read, but it's just a bit too difficult. But you want to show off your sophistication.
Yeah, it comes back to that conspicuous consumption idea,
That's wonderful. So was it initially a religious production, and then you talked about it changing, becomes more secular? Well, not necessarily secular, but it comes out of the monasteries. Roughly when was that sort of happening?
About the end of the 11th and the 12th century, because that's when you get the rise of the universities.
Right, okay.
That starts in Bologna in about 1080, I think, and then you have Paris and Oxford. And so then you have this shift where you have a greater demand for books because the students and the lecturers would have wanted more texts. And then you also have the rise of the merchant classes with a lot more money and better trade links in Europe. So they've got money to spend and are looking to spend it on something. And the monasteries couldn't cope with that logistically. And, they weren't also producing the kind of books that this new class and the students would want. So you have then the secular artisans kind of move into that vacuum. They see an opening and go for it. They have much more flexibility. They can move around. They're not enclosed in a monastery. They're not restricted by having to do the daily prayers as well. So they can work for much longer. So it's a logical step, really.
Is there a change in what they do, what kind of books are produced and how they're produced that happens around this time?
The process stays pretty much the same, but, there's more law texts that are needed. There's more scientific texts, that sort of thing. So there is a change. And also with the rise of these merchant classes, they really liked psalters and books of hours. Psalters you could find in monasteries anyway, but books of hours were more for the normal person who wanted to kind of follow the monastic hours. So these were prayer books that were ideal for them. And you can get some really, really elaborate examples of those where they've gone all in. And again, you see this kind of new impetus in manuscript artwork. These secular scribes are clearly experimenting a bit more. They've got a bit more freedom, they're not quite so constrained as they would have been in the monasteries. So that gives the movement a bit more of a push. And so you get these really, really beautiful manuscripts from about the 12th, 13th century that are down to these new secular artisans.
Are people writing new books and publishing them in the way we might think of today, or is it mostly copying old texts?
It depends. There are new texts that come out. I'm thinking particularly of Nicholas Love, although he was a monk at Mount Grace Priory, but he had a text that came out.
So there was some innovation. There was some innovation in the content as well.
Yeah.
But was it still mostly the ancients because they had all the wisdom? And I'm just trying to think of how sort of development of modern science ties in, and whether the sort of modern science, the philosophy behind sort of experimentation starts to come in and allow people to write books. And then if books become cheaper to make, you can afford to publish your work in a written form, whereas before you perhaps couldn't, even if you wanted to. I don't know. I just wondered.
Yeah, I mean, there are books that are popular at more times than others. And it's an interesting point as well that some texts do die out, some of the classical texts, because they're not recopied. They just go out of circulation and they're lost forever. But there was one example where the Arab scholars copied some classical texts which didn't fit in with the new Christian religion. So the early Christians allowed that to die out. But then in about the 12th and 13th century, were then able to translate these Arab texts back into Latin. So you kind of have that interesting cycle there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Was there anything else that you found particularly remarkable about your study of actually making books yourself? You talked about the material culture, the smells and the sounds and the rhythm of making books. Is there anything that helped you understand the past better by doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just needing to know and the logistics of making a manuscript and getting everything together in one place, especially with pigments, because you've got pigments that range from, being able to grow outside in your back garden, that don't need much, like woad and madder, which is a orangey red pigment. You can grow those in England, quite happily. But then you have other things like red lead and white lead, which would have needed a certain amount of chemical knowledge. The lead needs to be kept in a sealed container with vinegar, and then it needs to be heated. I mean, health and safety did not feature much at all. It would have been really nasty. But you would have needed those facilities to do that. And then you've got things like lapis lazuli, which was so popular in the medieval period, this beautiful, beautiful blue that only comes from Afghanistan. So you would have needed all those trade links as well, just to get it, to your little backwater in England. And just the thought of how you would coordinate all those things to come together to have a standardised palette for a particular manuscript, because you don't want to run out of lapis halfway through or something like that. So just the amount of planning it would have taken just to create one manuscript. And once you go through all those processes, you just realise how hard it must have been.
So there was a whole infrastructure. So you got pigments coming from Afghanistan. That's a long way on foot, basically, or ship, I suppose. But, it's nonetheless many, many weeks/months of travel.
Yeah.
And presumably it's heavy. It's a rock. So it's heavy.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get much. And I presume the further it travels, the more expensive it gets, because that was the way it was with spices.
Yeah.
And there's a whole merchant thing. Do I sell the spices here, or do I travel for another 6 weeks and sell them more expensively over there, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So across a quarter of the world, there was this industry that had to be coordinated to make these texts.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much for spending time with us. If people want to find out more about your work and your observations, you've got books and things. Can you share that?
Okay, so I have the Medieval Scriptorium. It's published by Reaction. It's actually gone into reprint, so I'm not sure how available it is at the moment. I think you can still get it on Amazon, and there are new copies coming soon. I do have a website as well, teachingmanuscripts.com, which gives an idea of some of the processes and has lots of my cats as well joining in the processes.
Good. Back in the old days, cats still joining in with the making of books.
Exactly, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.